I want to get some more right now on our top story, the legal saga over the fate of a Maryland man mistakenly deported to El Salvador. The White House doubling down right now on its refusal to bring Kilmar Abrego Garcia back to the United States, despite a U.S. Supreme Court order to, quote, facilitate his return to the U.S. while also not infringing on the president's ability to conduct foreign affairs. Let's get some serious analysis right now from the former U.S. District Court Judge Shira Scheindlin. Judge Scheindlin, thanks so much for joining us. Here's what President Trump said about this case on Friday. Listen to this.
If the Supreme Court said bring somebody back, I would do that. I respect the Supreme Court.
President Trump is now saying something very, very different. Is he defying a court order?
Well, he certainly isn't facilitating the return of Abrego Garcia, and that's what the court order requires him to do. I can't find any act he's taken that facilitates that return. I hear narrow construction that facilitate means, oh, I'll send an airplane if they want to let him go, and they, El Salvador, doesn't seem to want to let him go. But I think that's disingenuous at best. The president of the United States has a lot of power. El Salvador is a little country. The president could say to the president of El Salvador, I want this guy back. And that would be the end of it. Then he'd be on a plane and then he'd be returned. So I think the judge today is going to be very stern and is going to say to the lawyers for the government, what have you done to facilitate the return? And they're not going to have an answer. They're going to say, we can't get into foreign policy. That's foreign policy. And I don't believe that for a moment.
Right, that they're seizing on what was also in the Supreme Court opinion about the president having the ability to conduct foreign affairs and how the district court judge should really factor that in the decision. But the bottom line here, right, is that the White House says Abrego Garcia is under the control of El Salvador. The Salvadoran president says he has no power to release him. So who determines this man's fate?
Oh, I don't think the El Salvador president doesn't think he has the power to do it. The El Salvador president said, I won't send this terrorist back. I think he does have the power, but I think he's made the decision that the man is a member of MS-13 or of the I can't say it right, but the other terrorist group.
Right.
Thank you. But the fact is there's no proof at all. There's no evidence at all that he's a member of either. So that seems to be just another excuse. The U.S. has said, we made an error in sending this man out because there had been an order called withholding of removal, which means he can be removed. But he was. So we've admitted an error. We're not telling El Salvador to do it, and we should be. And of course, the El Salvador president has the power to do it if he wants to. But I think he thinks he's working with President Trump to not return this man. So yes, I see it as defiance, and I think the judge will see it as defiance. Then the question is, what can the judge do about it? Is she going to consider contempt proceedings? If she does, and if she holds the government in contempt, that brings it back to the Supreme Court, because there would be an appeal to the Fourth Circuit, then there would be the Supreme Court, and we'd hear from them again as to what's going to happen here.
As you know, Judge Scheindlin, the Trump administration is claiming that the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling only meant they had to remove, quote, domestic obstacles, not that they had to work with the government of El Salvador to try to bring Abrego Garcia home. They seem to be taking advantage of the court's vague language about, quote, facilitating his return. Do you think that argument will hold up?
I don't. I think they're trying to spin it favorable to the government. Each side here has claimed a victory, which is kind of interesting, but a 9-0 decision that brought every member of the court together, to me, is very clear. It means he didn't get due process, he has to be returned, and you have to facilitate that return. So I do think that the judge, as I said, will have very little patience for the government's position and will consider what can she do about it? What can the court do? Is she really without power?
Right, that's a big question. Before we let you go, Judge, I want to get your thoughts on President Trump freezing more than $2 billion in funding to Harvard. And just moments ago, in a post on Truth Social, Trump now says the university should lose its tax-exempt status and be taxed as a political entity. Is this constitutional?
No, it's not. And what Harvard has to do is what the law firms have done that are resisting Trump's orders. It will have to become the plaintiff in court. It will have to go to court and ask for an injunction and try to stop this order and take it through the court system, because it is not constitutional to lose its tax exempt status. Yes, federal funds can be withheld by federal employees, that's for sure. So sooner or later that can be done, but it is inappropriate to talk about taking away its tax exempt status. So I don't see that. But Harvard has taken a position that I think it had to take, because its faculty very much, 800 faculty members, I'm told, urge the university to stand up and fight this clearly unconstitutional order, as are the unconstitutional orders directed to the law firms.
Judge Shira Scheindlin, thank you so much for joining us.
The president taking this even further, saying that he's asked Pam Bondi to now study the law, potentially sending, he would say, violent U.S. citizens, deporting them out of the country to El Salvador. Legal grounds for that are what?
Non-existent, Kate. I mean, I think it's worth reminding folks, one of the complaints that we had in the Declaration of Independence at the beginning of the American Revolution was that King George was sending criminals to faraway prisons. It's almost like history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. There's no legal authority to send a U.S. citizen to serve a U.S. criminal sentence in a foreign prison. And, Kate, it would be pretty striking if there was, because that would mean any of us could be effectively disappeared into a prison with no U.S. legal constraints, with no potential human rights limits, no matter what. And that's a pretty scary proposition just arising out of this one immigration case.
Which is why getting your take is important, and also the fact that the president says he's asking the attorney general to then study the law when there is no legal grounds for it is noteworthy. Let's take it back then. I remember hearing you describe the Supreme Court's decision with regard to the Abrigo case as maddeningly vague. Is that then what's happened now, the necessary result of that vagueness? I mean, is the Trump administration continuing to ignore a judge or a justice's ruling just exactly what they were going to do, given how vague it was?
100%. I mean, Kate, I think a lot of us, at CNN and elsewhere, were saying Thursday night when the Supreme Court handed down its ruling that by switching from what Judge Zenas had done, which was say you must return him by a date and time certain, to this, wishy-washy word facilitate, the court had created exactly this wiggle room. And, Kate, maybe the Supreme Court was hoping that the Trump administration would take the hint that that decision was unanimous and would actually try to exert some pressure, diplomatic pressure, financial pressure on El Salvador to comply. I think we now know, even if we didn't last Thursday, that that's not going to happen. And so to the question of, so what's the next step in court? I don't doubt for a second is going to order the government to take more aggressive steps to facilitate Abrigo Garcia's return, to put diplomatic pressure, to put economic pressure on El Salvador. If the Trump administration says, we tried and we can't, one, Kate, that's a pretty stunning concession of impotence on the part of this administration. But two, I think the other piece of this is that's going to create a lot of pressure on federal courts in every other immigration case to not let anybody be removed from the country until we're absolutely sure that all the I's have been dotted and all the T's have been crossed.
Now I want to play for you how President Trump's aide, Stephen Miller, is trying to interpret the Supreme Court's decision, how he believes it leaves them with no obligation to do anything further. Let me play this from yesterday.
Yes, it was a 9-0
In
our favor against the district court ruling, saying that no district court has the power to compel the foreign policy function of the United States. As Pam said, the ruling solely stated that if this individual at El Salvador's sole discretion was sent back to our country, that we could deport him a second time.
Well,
no version of this legally ends up with him ever living here because he is a citizen of El Salvador.
Just want to get your take on his interpretation here.
Kate, it's not a very long decision from the Supreme Court. It's about 2.5 pages. It doesn't say anything like what Stephen Miller said it says. Folks can read it for themselves and see that. I think it's quite telling that Stephen Miller has to try to spin the decision as saying literally the opposite of what it said in order to justify what the Trump administration is doing. But Kate, if we step back for a second, there's a larger point here, which is no court has ever actually determined that Mr. Abrego Garcia is a member of MS-13, as the Trump administration claims, that he was properly removable. And so we're at the point, Kate, where if this is an argument that anyone finds persuasive, that means they can do it to us too. They can say, I'm a member of MS-13. They can say, Joe Citizen is a member of MS-13, and use that as this justification for removing them, disappearing them right into the Salvadoran prison. If that's a world in which the courts are going to be powerless, Kate, again, I think the key is courts are not going to take that lightly. And I think the result will instead be courts imposing far more onerous restrictions on the government's ability to remove folks from the country in the first place, ironically thwarting, right, the whole sort of justification for this policy in the first place.